I wanted to welcome you all to this panel as part of the Queen's International 2018 Public Program Series. It's my great pleasure to introduce this panel discussion titled Casualties, Gender, Technology, and the Virtual Body. We're thrilled to welcome speakers Silvia Federici, Haley Bueschlen, Shaka McGlotten, and moderator Sarah Leonard. You can find all their bio information on your chairs and the brochures, and my colleague Adrian back there has some more if you need. I wanted to make a special note that we're using CART services or text transcription for this panel in English. And transcription services are also provided in Spanish using Google Translate. This is a new program we're incorporating in today's talk. So please do offer feedback to one of our museum representatives as we're trying out this new program. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand it off to Sarah.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here in this incredibly beautiful space. And I have the lucky job of moderating a panel of 3 very brilliant people who are actually going to do all the work here. And we're going to be sort of speaking on themes of the internet and surveillance, quantification and control of the body under capitalism, and how we forge identity under those conditions. And so that is a great, big, broad canvas we're going to be working on. So first, everyone's going to talk about or read from their work a little bit to give us some grounding in what each of us is talking about. And then I'm going to put a question or two to the group to discuss. And then we're going to have Q&A. So hopefully you all will get involved and be thinking about questions. So we're going to start with the great Silvia Federici, who is one of our great theorists on these themes, wrote Caliban and the Witch, which provided a sort of untold history of how the transition to capitalism entailed exceptional violence, especially against women, and the enclosure of public resources, public space, into a private commodity. And so to begin, I'm going to ask Silvia to talk a little bit about that work to sort of ground us in those ideas before we get all wrapped up in the internet. So Silvia, I will kick it to you.
Does it work? Okay. Hi. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you, to all Lindsay and all those who have organized this event. Yeah, in the 15 minutes I have, I'm going to touch very schematically on some issues that I've been working on, beginning with Caliban and the Witch, and explain a little bit where I was coming from, and also the implication of some of the theories that I've developed in that work for the present. I began to be concerned with the question of the body and the capitalist control over the body at the time when I decided to rethink the history of capitalist development, rethink it not from the point of view of the factory, the wage worker, which was the traditional Marxist approach, but from the point of view of that other sphere of life that the Marxist socialist tradition always left outside, which is the reproduction of life, procreation, child raising, and all the activity that reproduce human life. The moment I did that, the moment I began to rethink how capitalism developed, what were the processes, the steps that capitalism had to introduce, in order to be able to impose new forms of production, new forms of work discipline, etc. The issue of the body became very, very clear. It became very clear that it was not enough, for example, to push people off the land, to make sure that they would become a certain type of worker that would work into manufacturing and later into industry. That there was a whole set of discipline that had to be implemented to make them work. And I resumed, basically, I summarized those disciplines in one process, what I call the mechanization of the body. One of the projects capitalism had to accomplish was to transform, a body. For example, a body of peasants in Europe who were used to the rhythms of the season, their work schedule, their work activities were very much shaped, by a kind of relationship, very close relationship with the natural world. It had to reshape its bodies. It had to reshape their lives in a way that they could fit a different kind of production. And so I basically looked into how capitalism turned the body, of the future wage worker into a work machine, how this was done. I also began to polemize with Foucault, remember Foucault, surveillance and discipline, arguing that, there's not only one history of the body in capitalism. There are many different histories, because what capitalism did to the body of the future wage worker was not the same as it did, for example, in the case of women, right, who were not destined to work in industry, but they were destined to become houseworkers, child raisers, etc., etc. And there is the body of people in Europe, and there's the body of people, destined, forced into slavery. And there too, there is a difference between if the enslaved are women, if the enslaved are men. So I began to look into the idea of multiple histories and the fact that we cannot understand what happens to the body in capitalist society unless we look at it coming from all these different experiences, which are profoundly different. Now, all I want to do now is to concentrate a little bit on the question of women. Looking at the history of capitalism and the development of capitalism in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, one of the events that I came into contact was the famous witch hunts. For 3 centuries, women were persecuted in Europe, and then also, in the so-called New World, accused of being witches, right? And to make, because of lack of time, I basically argued through the witch hunts. The witch hunt was one of those processes that enabled the state and the capitalist class to take control of the body of women, and to turn the body of women into a machine for the production of workers. And I want to say something here. Every system, every social system that is exploitative of human life has to control the body of people. That's obvious, right? But there's something special about capitalism, because capitalism is a system that has made of the exploitation of human labor like the most important element in the production of wealth. It has made the exploitation of women's labor, of people's labor. For example, previous society, previous social system, right, consider the major source of wealth was land, right? The more land you had, the more powerful. For the capitalist, the more workers you have, the more powerful. So capitalism sees human labor, this particular substance, so the interest in the body as a container of labor capacity, the body as a container of work capacities. And in the case of women, the body of women as the factory for the production of workers. The factory for the production of workers. Think of it. All the workers of the world have come out of a body of women. That's a tremendous power. And not accidentally, capitalism from the very beginning to this present, to today, has been extremely interested in controlling the capacity, in deciding, how women are going to deal, with their sexuality, with procreation, with their body, extremely, and certainly the witch hunts, right, that accused women of being satanic whenever they try to control, for example, with abortion or with forms of contraception, right? the witches were always accused of killing children. You know, killing children is a metaphor to say that women were trying actually to control their body, and in many cases refusing maternity or trying to abort, right? Now, flying into the present, I would say that, in fact, today this has continued. And in fact, we have seen a new drive, a new capitalist drive to place control over the body of women starting from the 70s, right? Because in the 70s, you have a broad women's revolt, right? Women saying, you know, we want to control our body, we want to be able to abort, we want to decide whether we are going to have children or we are not going to have children. So since that time, basically the capitalist class have had to use new tactics, new strategies. And one of the objectives that they have today, which I think is you know, camouflaged in all kinds of ways, is to try to free itself from the body of women, right? To find ways to create, reproduce life, you know, in some sort of artificial womb, but certainly outside and independently of the body of women. And this kind of research is carried on, you know, under different labels. For example, to deal with infertility, right? To deal, and everything it's presented, all these strategies of control are presented as strategies that will give women more options. They will give women more choice. Right? But in reality, when we look at the new reproductive technologies that have been implemented since the 1970s, we see that under the label of choice, there has been a way in which the state and the capitalist class have attempted to recuperate the control over the body of women. Because many of these new technologies do not really give women any choice. They in a sense, they in fact even curtail the possibility of deciding. And you know, I think I'm almost through the time I have, but I want to say that maybe in the discussion we can look more in detail, right, at what, for instance, has been offered. You know, like in vitro fertilization, gene editing. Well, gene editing is where you, for example, intervene in the embryo, and you know, into, for example, this has not been done yet, but it's being experimented. Intervene in the embryo with the argument that you can prevent diseases in the child to be born, right? But nevertheless, you change the DNA of the embryo, right? And also, you know, the sonograms to figure out the sex of the child to be born, etc., etc. So all of these technologies, again, you know, they basically give the medical profession and the state a whole new power over the body of women, who in many cases do not know, do not have the information necessary to decide whether they want to submit to them or not. And what has been verified, and I will conclude with that, is that when these new options, right, are put on the table, like for example, now you can decide if, you know, you can have practices whereby you can figure out the sex of the child, and you can also figure out if the child, the embryo, carries certain diseases or not. Once these options are there, you cannot really refuse them. You cannot really refuse them. Right? Already women have been penalized for not wanting to abort, for example, embryos that were supposed to have certain abnormalities. And women have been penalized for refusing C-sections, right? They were considered necessary given, you know, the way the embryo was, the fetus was, you know, developing. right? So we have to be very, very careful. We are very careful in front of all this big ideological orchestration that says, oh God, now we have all these possibilities that, you know, our mother, grandmother did not have. Because in reality, when you look at the way they're organized and the program that they carry, we find that they're really very detrimental to the possibility of women to really make a decision. And well, and I think this is important to see because, and here I really conclude, today all too much in the feminist discourse, in feminist activism, there is a focus on abortion. This is very important, yes, of course, but there are many, many other issues that are not given equal attention and are extremely important. Not only because abortion is only one part of decision making, it is very important also to struggle to have the condition under which you can give birth and have children without paying with your life, right? But also because there's a lot of policies that are being passed. You know, several states, for instance, are now in the process of giving rights to fetuses. The moment, so fetuses now in the United States are gaining more rights than the women. You know, rights to fetuses as person, the denomination of a fetus is already a person, means that now the woman more and more is seen as a container, is seen as subservient to the well-being of the fetus. You know, there is a conflict almost that is being produced. And women are already being incarcerated for engaging in activities that are perfectly legitimate, but are seen as possibly having a negative impact on the fetus. To the point that a national health advocate, Lynn Paltrow, very, very important woman, who is here in New York, she has said that particularly when it comes to poor women, women of color, immigrant women, today deciding to have a child often puts you outside of the boundary of the Constitution. And she's spoken about the fact that there is a process ongoing of criminalization of pregnancy. And I'd like to say more about this in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to Haley now, who is going to read some of her poetry that is picking up on some of these same themes, especially around surveillance and the internet. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi. Thank you, Lindsay and Sophia and Basira for putting all of this together and having me in the show. So I'm reading from my piece that's currently on view. That's a series of video poems about internet surveillance, fascism, queerness, and longing. And it's about 10 poems, and I'll read them continuously with small breaks in between. So, when I was 7, I began talking to an automated phone operator. I would wait to hear her voice for a dial tone on a landline. Sometimes I would hide in my parents' closet, and the lineage of electrical wires. And in the lineage of electrical wires, it is important to remember that it is the lineage of electrocuting dogs and anarchists in New York. Where these cords curl like snakes fucking near my bed without sound is where I reach the end of Tinder. Where there is a gradient of loss function well oiled through its layers. Where it is likely that devout gray water in Saratoga Springs cools trillions of terabytes at the NSA. Where there is data, there is death. Where there is death, there is data. Where there is data, there can be no death. To ensure the cable conforms to the seabed where sharks are older than trees, where they lose their teeth in fiber optics. There is a machine in a glass factory dropping thousands of phones over and 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 over, pouring itself into a crucible. The algorithm chose me to watch a man holding a piranha bite through steel before the shoot Nat Geo's goofy Tintin colonists shake off cargo pants soaked in blood, and the veneer animation crawls by my feed. In an old painting classroom, a trash can reads, "Please empty at night." Not looking at myself in an excess of looking, to call this waves is too much credit overdrawn, and I am covered with my gender fluid water bears and JPEGs. What is my body not yet cached? Gold mines collapse in floods, the weight of wet, moving clay, heavier than any tunnel. Timelines curl up like string theory, HTML touches my face like beaded doorways, to follow Marsha P. Johnson and throw bricks and bits and terabyte all cops. It's common knowledge that they taste good done well. At a sight and non-sight more beautiful than the spiral jetty will ever be, like a snake that broke its back, turning to look behind an archive. Rating 4.554444, other cages online. Periodically follows the cage being made throughout a portion of each revolution thereof. I love this cage. It's easy to put together. I just wish I could order another floor for it. Great starter cage. Once the cage is set up properly, it's a great cage. This cage is way too small and easy to escape. Some will feel very unsure and insecure in a round cage because it has no corners, but I can roll this cage outside. You will see at the top of the round cage, the space between its bars gradually gets smaller and smaller until they meet the center point. This thing wrapped in time and blood, and how she says her cry face is ugly, and Kylie is on the Hollywood Strip asking where did you get these fake lip kits in her horrible pink Bentley, buying houses with her proximal carpals with rapid force, scroll through the articulate surfaces of 11 million images. May you die with your well-lit croissant. And what fluids transfer down hills from here, where eyes are tacked shut with models of copper or rose gold, where Kim K bends her neck and giggles, applying mascara to a fake cadaver, still breathing an undead reality. Vets will neuter and slice off the tips of cats' ears to put them outside. What fine memes they will say.
Here I'm going to turn it over to Shaka, who has a presentation here that is going to be drawing out these themes as well, and I believe also has a visual component. Should the gods be with us?
Hi everyone, thanks to the organizers and everyone for being here. So since 2013 I've been working on a project called Black Data. To give you the briefest overview of this project, it's a project that combines ethnographic research at crypto parties, which are community-oriented events that focus on, among other things, digital privacy and security. And it combines this with work that I'm doing with artists of color who grapple with issues tied to surveillance, big data, and algorithms, especially as they impact marginalized populations. So the work of these artists also, very importantly, charts routes toward imagining future freedoms from all of the forms of technological enclosure and capture that I think both Silvia and Haley have gestured toward. So this little mini presentation is a remix of some of that other work. So some of you might know the show, The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. There's a really funny episode where Kimmy and Titus Andromedon, who you see featured here, binge watch Netflix. And Titus says, you know how Al Gore invented the internet? Well, he also invented a rhythm for it. It's a powerful rhythm. It's called the Al Gore rhythm. So, as the artist Hito Sturl has observed, humans and things intermingle in ever newer constellations to become bots or cyborgs. As humans feed affect, thought, and sociality into algorithms, algorithms feed back into what used to be called subjectivity. So one way of understanding this, or another way of understanding this, is in terms of what might be called computational performativity. For those of you who aren't familiar with this concept of performativity, essentially it describes a process by which something that claims only to name a thing actually brings that thing into existence. The classic example from speech act theory is wedding vows, right? So you say these words, but then something else happens. It's not just that you're saying words, you become married. So computational power, I think of increasingly as an attractant, or rather it's attracted to us. But of course we're also attractants to one another, though there's no guarantee that things will stay that way. As recent research suggests that iGen are going on fewer dates and having less sex than previous generational cohorts. But bad news for the Generation Xers and Yers among us, we're winding down too. Machine learning and persuasive design increasingly hack our desires in increasingly molecular ways, keeping our eyes glued to screens and our bodies arranged around our phones or otherwise contorted, our fingers tapping, typing, swiping, and scrolling away. All of these haptics might lead us to one another, but they have already led us to our devices. Perhaps the swiped right singularity arrived long ago, elements and minerals finding in one another the unicorn promises of relating. Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. I'd like to introduce you to cobalt, germanium, graphite, indium, lithium, platinum, potassium, sand, silicon, silver, tantalum, tin, and tungsten. I don't really know what an algorithm is, and you might not either. Outside of what theorist Tina Bucher calls those whoa moments, when we get suggestions to add a friend we haven't seen for a while but we're just talking about, or when we get Hermes ads after our partner has fallen down the fantasy shopping rabbit hole, algorithms often fade from view, receding into the rhythms of daily life. So they're largely invisible in the it's just another everyday of looking up places to eat or finding scholarly articles kind of way. Here's a definition of algorithms, though, acquired, of course, with the help from Google's own predictive algorithm. An algorithm is a set of steps or tools, usually, but not only computational, that are used to solve problems. So you have an array of inputs, the algorithm works on them, and then you get the outputs you're looking for. Unless the outputs aren't what you're looking for, or they're illegible to human understanding. It's not what you're looking for when image recognition software mistakenly categorizes the carrot you're holding as a cell phone, or men in women, men in kitchens as women, or people as dogs, or in a famous example from Google photo tagging that recognized black people as gorillas. So the outputs of algorithms are illegible when you can't figure out why these things are happening. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of streaking. Streaking refers to an uninterrupted back and forth series of communications. The term emerges from Snapchat, but it's now widely used across other social media apps. And the idea here is that you just, every day you communicate with a certain person, that symbolizes a streak, that signifies a streak, and the idea is that you keep the streak going. So I think of streaks as gamified sociality, right? You're being induced and incited to continue this back and forth contact, even when there is no content to the contact. So some of my students have described to me maintaining streaks with family or friends, and they keep the streak alive, which is another expression, simply sometimes by sending a blank image or a blank image, or a blank snap. And so they don't necessarily have to have anything in them, but the idea is that you try to win at this game of sociability. So the anthropologist Natasha Schull has written a really great book, came out a few years ago, about machine gambling in Las Vegas. So machine gambling is, whether it's a slot machine or another kind of gambling device. And she talks about in this book this idea of the machine zone. And the machine zone is a kind of inversion of the concept of flow, right? When you're immersed in this really absorbing activity that you lose a sense of yourself, you lose a sense of time. The machine zone is also flow, but I think of it as dark flow. And this is how one of her informants described it. It's like being in the eye of a storm. Your vision is clear on the machine in front of you, but the whole world is spinning around you and you can't really hear anything. You aren't really there. You're with the machine, and that's all you're with. In recent years, former Google design ethicist Tristan Harris has revealed the ways that media platforms exploit innate psychological vulnerabilities to maximize time on device. As with gambling and streaking, where the wins of streaking like gambling are really modest when they don't put you in the red. So streaking's mantra again is don't break the streak. And this is a demand. And I think that's a really important question to ask, whether this demand comes from other people or from our more than non-human machines, right? The ways that algorithms and AI are increasingly working to not just encourage particular behavior, but to predict it. So in a streak, an exchange snap signifies something like, I'm still thinking of you. Although, as I said, sometimes these snaps are contentless. So I think that the I'm still thinking of you often has this uncomfortable, unspoken parenthetical that's implicit in it, which is, yeah, but maybe not really. Of course, if you don't have intimates or regular strangers with loose tie benefits, or if you don't feel like you're winning, you can rely on Snapchat's own algorithm, which can guide you toward others toward whom your life gaming should be directed. Coming back to Tristan Harris, and this is the organization he founded called the Center for Humane Technology, he describes these different kinds of hijacks that social media companies use to, again, keep us on our devices. So I'm going to give you 3 of them. So, and these are especially useful for understanding a phenomenon like streaking. So one is slot machining. Another is the fear of missing something important, which is kind of a variation on FOMO. This is FOMSy. And the third is social approval. That's kind of, I like that too. So social media feeds, scrolling, swiping, and refreshing pull downs mirror the action of pulling a slot machine lever. So when you refresh a feed, right, it's not an accident of design that it resembles that action of a slot machine. You're waiting kind of to see what's going to happen, and you're waiting to see how you're going to win, right? And whether that's winning by seeing a thirst trap or some food that someone posted a picture of, or how many likes your most recent, picture got, right? The operation, the psychological operation, is the same, right? It creates it's a psychological vulnerability that has to do with anticipation, and just like the social media pings, it creates a dopamine response, one that can actually be exhausted. So the other one is FOMSy again. This is the idea that, and this is something that I think is important in the context of streaking as well, is that you return constantly to an app to make sure you're not missing out, right? And so I think of Tinder or other dating apps or hookup apps like Grindr, right? This idea that you come back again and again is something about you're hoping that something is going to happen. You're hoping you're not going to miss out on something. And then social approval. So part of what brings you back to these apps, and I think if you're kind of trolling for the likes on Instagram or Facebook, right? What this means is that you just want approval. How many of you have taken down a social media post because it didn't get enough likes? Okay, I see a few heads nodding here. right? So this is the idea that you're not just putting something out there, right, just sort of out in the world, you're also waiting for something back. And the design of the apps, this is not an accident, right? Thumbs up, hearts, right? We want this approval. We're innately built to crave it. This is one of the places where many of these hijacks have been developed. In fact, Tristan Harris went to this program. It's called the Persuasive Technology Lab. And if you ever go to their website, it's very interesting. They celebrate many of the ways that their tools are meant to assist us in our daily life. So if any of you use a Fitbit or any other kind of fitness tracker, they say that the ways that these fitness trackers work or encourage you to continue walking are one of the benefits of persuasive design, right? But of course, the examples that I provided before, demonstrate some of the more sinister applications of the same principles. Okay, so to Black data. So the lives of Afro-descended peoples in particular have been shaped by a variety of calculuses. People's lives have been transformed into machines for the motions of parts, which is one definition of algorithms. For the Black scholar Catherine McKittrick, she writes, "This is where we begin. This is where historic Blackness comes from. The list, the breathless numbers, the absolutely economic, the mathematics of the unliving." So Black bodies have historically been quantified, identified as data points, as information, and various operations of race and racism reduce Black life to what I think of as a numerology of bare life. It would appear as commodities, revenue streams, statistical deviations, or vectors of risk. And Sophia Noble has written this really great book called Algorithms of Oppression, and she, in it, describes some of the ways that histories of colonialism, that are also, of course, wrapped up with histories of enslavement, live on in the present of digital divides. So in her book, she focuses on what she calls technological redlining. She points to the particular impacts of this technological redlining for Black people. She writes that African American identities are often a commodity, exploited as titillating fodder in a network that traffics in racism, sexism, and homophobia for profit. So for any of you who are familiar with the business models of Facebook or Twitter, one of the ways, again, that they maximize time on device is to really incite anger, right? So you go to check out your friends, but you're gonna stay on Twitter, and I think Twitter, this is especially notorious for this, through a sense of outrage. Right? So when we understand the ways, say, that pornography operates, or we understand the ways, even something like this idea of black girl magic, right, operates, this is something that this is something that is completely captured by the sort of capitalist logics that Silvia describes in her work as well, right? We want to participate, but we're limited to our participation through particular forms of consumption. Now, I'm not throwing too much shade at Black Girl Magic. I think as a sort of social movement, it's actually really important to celebrate Black beauty, Black femme beauty, but it's important also to remember that this is not outside the logics of capitalism. And of course, Blacks have also historically been excluded from blue and white collar jobs associated with high technology sectors. So I'll talk about a couple of artists that I'm interested, or maybe just one artist that I'm interested in. Right now, one of the many that I'm looking at. So this is the artist Miseen Aloha, who situates histories of rendering some bodies disposable or invisible in recent work on algorithmic violence. She's been especially focused on missing data that disappears people and the social worlds that they inhabit. In work on data and mapping, she considers regions populated by marginalized populations that appear invisible to informatic capture. So some of the examples she provides are favelas and informal settlements. Another example is Makoko, which is a floating lake community off the coast of Lagos that has approximately 100,000 residents. But on Google Maps, these favelas or Makoko are completely blank, as if no one exists there. So this is a project called Pathways, in which she makes more intimate maps derived from people's lived experiences. So she talks to people and asks them to draw maps of things that matter to them and of their relationships and where they go. And this is one of the results of that project. So this is, again, in contrast to the efforts of states and corporations to achieve kind of total informatic capture. So part of what she's asking is, what does it mean to live in a place that's invisible to data, right? Do people who live there exist? If you work to decenter data's hegemony, one of the results of this is that you're going to challenge the ways that social worlds and individual lives are datafied or quantified. So in this context, we can talk about something like fugitivity, which comes from, is developed by the theorist Fred Moten, which is this idea that to escape, you can engage in certain practices of refusal. In this context, one way of doing this would be to create sort of, make yourself opaque to these systems. And this has benefits in an era of total surveillance, right? Which is, I think, something Haley is also interested in hacking in her self-edition project. So here's the flip side to opacity, of course. So missing data also limits political representation or access to public resources. So being invisible to data or existing only as data can each function to cast people further away from the few remaining resources that remain to be distributed in this ever-decreasing, ever-shrinking public sphere. So this is one other project of Mimi, and then I'll close. So here, this is called the Library of Missing Data Sets, and she created a catalog of data sets that, if they were to exist, might actually be of benefit to society, but that are not currently available. For example, publicly available gun trace data, or public lists of citizens on domestic surveillance lists, or employment statistics that include those working without pay or with virtually no pay in federal prisons. Which I think are, again, this is sort of imagining data that doesn't exist, but hopefully should. So I opened earlier with a quote from Guido Sturl, and I'll close with another one from a project from 2015 called How Not to Be Seen. So she writes that the situation that most people face is that they are being visible all the time to certain modes of capture. That's unfortunate, I think, because people might want to escape from this inordinate amount of constant surveillance. But on the other hand, she says, being invisible can be deadly. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for those three.
That's probably us.
We have one too many mics. For those really fascinating presentations, and I'm going to try to ask a few questions just to put these in conversation with each other and circle back to explore some things further, and then we'll kick it out to questions. So I have, I teach undergraduate students sometimes, and they read Silvia Federici's essay, Wages Against Housework, which is all about figuring out how to quantify, demand compensation for, and thereby reject housework. And there was, after this, more recently, a piece of art, I guess, a project called Wages for Facebook, that was about quantifying the amount of labor that people perform for free for Facebook by participating in the system and therefore allowing Facebook to sell ads. You are not the customer of Facebook, of course, you are the product. And I think students really instinctively understood this. They understand they're working for free. At the same time, they're almost allergic to the idea because they feel like if they were to make some sort of demand, Facebook would be taken away from them. And this is somehow a more like traumatizing idea than continuing to work for free. And so sort of riffing off the last presentation, we're all made anxious all the time by our visibility and by the sort of unpaid work we do, and by the fact that these platforms are designed to make us anxious if we don't participate. At the same time, we are appalled by the idea of being invisible because it would take away the social life that we have. And I found it useful to think in terms of primitive accumulation, which is a central concept of your work, in that if you want to think of something that had not been commodified being taken over, our very social relations are being taken over by these platforms and made into commodities. And people can feel that even if they don't fully understand or think about it that way. So I guess I sort of want to dive in and see, you know, you were talking about reproduction specifically, and it seems like right now we're in a phase where optimizing yourself to be the best worker is actually extremely popular. You have your Fitbit, so you know you're in really good shape, and you have a lot of statistics about yourself. You know, we track each other very closely on social media. It's very competitive, and you're always sort of seeking to be the best. In the case of women, it seems that perhaps there's a contradiction between reproducing workers and yourself working all the time. And we're sort of trying to square this with technology by delaying pregnancy, or, you know, sort of coming up with other ways to change the life cycle. And so I wondered if you wanted to get back into that. You had mentioned the criminalization of pregnancy. You were talking about reproductive technologies. I wonder if you wanted to sort of address, you know, is technology being used to, is there a contradiction in women both needing to reproduce society and being pushed to be perfect workers? And how does like the level of surveillance affect this, and the level of, you know, it seemed like you were going somewhere there, so I'm just going to leave this enormous question with you.
This covers a huge range. So well, you get to lead
It covers a big range because it deals with the whole issue of the women with respect to, you know, these open gates. The gates have been open so that now women can work outside the home and have presumably all these great jobs, where we know that it's just a lie, because yes, women, the majority, have jobs outside the home, but actually these are kind of jobs that don't even give you a minimal amount of autonomy. I think few people realize, for instance, that the majority of women now, working class women, have to have at least 2 jobs, and even with 2 jobs, your wage is to get a loan. So the good thing about having a job is that it gives you the possibility to get something that can give you the credit so you can get a loan. So that, for example, all these companies that you probably heard of, the payday loan, you know, they're really tailored to women, to the working woman, the so-called working woman. I say so-called because actually women work also in the home. But so that you get paid and you rush to get a loan, right? So there's nothing of the great liberation, emancipation that is associated with it. And in addition, as I was talking about before, right, there's a whole new area of regulation that is coming down, controlling the whole process of reproduction, the process of procreation. I should have said about surveillance before. I talked about the criminalization of pregnancy, right? I see that it's a way, it's an indirect way of sterilizing women. It's an indirect way of deciding who can reproduce and who cannot reproduce, right? It's presented in the form of a defense of life, right? So, for example, making sure women have been arrested in this country now if they were in a car accident and they told the police that they were pregnant, they were arrested for, you know, reckless behavior, jeopardizing the fetus. Women have been arrested, they are in jail now, for instance, for taking drugs, I mean medicine, legal medicine, but they could have an negative impact on the baby they were carrying. And so literally, you can be accused in some states of manslaughter, right? Because now the fetus is a person, so there's all of it. And there's other things that are happening in terms of surveillance. For example, it appears that in a number of states, the police is now collaborating with doctors and nurses in the hospital to ensure that if they see something in blood, the blood test that they do to pregnant women, they report immediately to the police. And they will probably do it because otherwise they could lose their license. So there is a cool way. Imagine, you're going to a clinic because you're pregnant, you want to know, and you have a blood test, and it could happen that the next day you have a cop at your door because your blood test didn't come out in a way that it was totally clear. This is happening. Apparently, there are also meetings within the police, nurses and doctors in hospital, where this is what, for example, Lynn Paltrow has documented, where they teach the doctors how to organize a blood test or any other test in such a way that it can be more easily used in a court case if they're going to build a case against the woman, etc., etc. So there's a whole new level, right, of control that, of course, is being exercised, towards women that cannot afford to go to a private clinic, etc., etc., right? So this is really part also of the great, division and hierarchization, right? And this is reserved mostly, to women who have no resources, who have seen, right, as, and I think there's a political factor, as women that, are not seen as reproducing people that the system want to be reproduced. So this is also another important aspect that is happening when you add it to the condition of work, right? Do you see that? When I speak about the fact that the job that most women have are jobs that do not allow them, autonomy or some economic independence or some economic security, that also has to do with the question of reproduction. How you're going to be able, to have a child, to build a future, when you don't know if tomorrow you'll have this job, or when you have a job that doesn't give you any time or the money, for example, to have a child in a daycare. This is very, very important. It's the condition in which so many women are living today. And it's not an accident that on a working class level, both for black and white women, the life expectancy has been diminished. So life expectancy is going down. So we keep hearing now, oh, this is great, now we can live up to 100, and it's going up and up, and at 70 you're a youth, etc. In reality, the life expectancy has been decreasing. And as we know, women are now the ones who are using the maximum. They are the main consumer of antidepressant because really they face a life with almost no security, with very little money, and struggling continuously to fight about what's going to happen tomorrow, and work, right? So I think that our struggle in the 70s for wages for housework, I think, was very well intended because it was a refusal to do more unpaid labor, and it was a decision to say, well, let's be paid for the money, for the work that we do. As welfare women on welfare, they were saying, right? The government says that this is charity, but actually when there is a war, they come and take our children. Actually, our children are in their factory, are in their workplaces. And then they tell us they're having a child, oh, it's your individual business, right? And the idea was that with that money, women would have the possibility to decide whether they would also want to work outside the home or not, and not be forced to take any job that would come along, and also expose, make visible, this invisibility, make visible what it is that is taking place in this kitchen, in this bedroom, in these communities, right? Which has never been considered as real work. So I think that those issues are still very relevant today. No? And I wanted to say how important what you said. I mean, you said many important things, but I wanted to make a comment about the last point. This dilemma of the visibility and non-visibility is such an incredible dilemma. You know, I lived in Nigeria for some years, and at that time, when there was a census, it was known that many people even went outside the country, crossed the border not to be counted. Because there was a history from the colonial period. To be counted means that, you know, to put yourself online for all kinds of bad things. The moment you're counted, the moment they know where you are, right? But as you said, there's also the other side, right? So how to be visible and yet visible in a way that doesn't make you vulnerable.
I guess to turn it to you, Haley, you were also talking about, you know, sort of being mind and data as death, data as also infinite life, whether you like it or not. And I think getting into this question of, you know, visibility online can obviously create community. You talked about Black Girl Magic. It can create community. It can even create movements. At the same time, it is not necessarily outside the logic of capitalism. And it can be a positive movement, and it can be making money for Twitter, and the way you interact is shaped by the platform. So it's an incredibly complicated situation. And I wonder, in thinking about your work, if you could talk a little bit about that tension.
Can you rephrase the question? Like just...
So ways in which being seen can give you belonging, but can also extract a lot from you.
Yeah, I think that there is, I was talking about like the body being cached as well, and how like the body can be this ultimate capital accumulation. And I think Wilderson talks about how capitalism began with the absolute violence of the transatlantic slavery. Yeah.
I just wanted to riff on that. I mean, first, thanks again to Silvia for all of the work that you've done and just the clarity of your thinking and the ways that you've helped write histories that would not otherwise have been written. And then, you know, Haley, I was really struck by what you just said and how it ties into Silvia's work. This idea, when you said cached, you know, I heard both the C-A-S-H-E-D cached, but also the C-A-C-H-E-D cached, right? And I think these two things are completely, you know, inextricable right now. And I'm also struck in the ways that, again, this tension between visibility and invisibility, transparency and opacity, as you asked in your question, right, the way that participating in social media or other, you know, similar platforms gives us access to something, but it also, you know, extracts something from us, right? This is, you know, this is a form of unpaid, you know, labor, right? Facebook should be paying us, not the other way around. You had a quote, I'm not sure if I got it just right, but you said something in one of your poems, once the cage is set up properly, it's a very nice cage. I thought that was just sort of such a powerful image that really gets at something about both these histories of social reproduction, of gender reproduction, and the ways that our work is really nonstop. It's 24 hours a day, it's every second of every day, it's the self-optimization, it's trolling for likes, it's posting on Instagram, how this is, you know, completely at this molecular level, in our bodies. But the phrase also seemed to me totally Trumpian in this way, right? Right? Like, it's a great wall, it's the best wall, it's a very good wall. Once the wall is built, it's really good. It's gonna be the best, greatest wall ever. You know, I can just hear him saying, well, once the cage is set up properly, it's a very good cage, it's the greatest cage, it's the best cage ever, it's the cleanest cage, it's a gold cage, right? And I was also finally struck just by the phrase that you have, which, if you haven't seen Haley's piece, Self-Edition, also I really recommend it, where, can you just say a little bit about it? Or do you want to say about, why don't you say something?
Yeah, it's where I did a durational performance for a year. It was very tedious and self-inflicted, but I auditioned myself and changed my name every month for a year. So I was 1 of 12, 2 of 12, 3 of 12, and so on. So my first name was 1, my middle name was Of, and my last name was 12.
I think we can take some questions. I believe this entire museum shuts down in 20 minutes, ish. And so I think maybe we can take 2 questions together to start, so we have a couple things. Does anyone want to ask a question? Where else will you have 3 such brilliant people of whom to ask questions? Okay, we have one here. Let me see some other hands. Can I just like not see? Is that the problem? Okay. They're in the back. And then this, yes. Go ahead, and then in the back there.
Thank you for all those very intriguing thoughts on technology and on how it affects us. But in the same time, you kind of acknowledge that you, on your own, don't have a lot of experience in these fields. How do you reconcile with that, and do you plan to do something about it? For example, get some actual expertise in technology? Or I misunderstood?
Thank you.
Did you want to bundle 2 questions?
No, we'll take them 2 together, yeah.
Okay. So I'm interested in hearing more about practices of refusal that all of you touched upon, and maybe from Silvia specifically about kind of collective systems of refusal, because so often the refusal is again on the individual, and as individuals we feel really alone in this system, and I'm resentful of kind of capitalism pushing the responsibility back on the individual. So what are some kind of more collective, intersectional, interdisciplinary ways of refusing?
I'm not sure if I got the question correctly, but you're asking about technology, what we can do, expertise?
I believe the question was about, for the panelists, your own expertise in the field of technology, is that right? Yes. Not, as people who are not directly working in tech, how that relates to your own commentary on tech.
I think I want to answer. I'm not. I'm not an expert in tech, but I have a morbid curiosity, and I'm not like anti-civ or anything, but I suppose my response or expertise would be to look at dead cows, sharks, and termites, because they're actually the top 3 reasons that fiber optic cables fail.
I think you just did something, I think, really expertly, which I would also just echo, which is to sort of challenge the premise of the question. So I'm an ethnographer and an artist. So I'm happy to talk about cultural histories of technology. I've talked with programmers and coders. I can talk about the historical development of the internet as a technology, the relationship that had to the military-industrial complex and post-World War II changes, the ways that histories of encryption lead directly to the development of some of the technologies that we use today, the way that Charles Babbage created an early computer powered by steam, but was never actually developed, though was prototyped and could actually have been built, but wasn't for a variety of historical and economic conditions. So I think that the premise of the question is a very interesting one, right? What do we mean by technology, right? Do we mean a familiarity with the sort of, with coding, with programming, with developing infrastructures? And I think that Haley's response is actually really fascinating, right? So what do we mean by technology? We can look at what are the three things that are the fiber optic cables that dead cows, sharks, and termites. This is also part of the reality of technology today, right? Or understanding, for example, what we were talking about before with the ways that psychologists, designers, and other technologists are working together to ensure, to maximize time on device, right? Which in the end is also about developing and producing wealth for corporations. So I think that the question is a very interesting one, right? That, what do we even mean by technology?
I want to add something on that, which is that, yeah, this is not, I think what we said, a critique of technology in general, right? Because we always need, from the time you use a spade, that's technology. But I think it's also important to see that each technology has built within it a certain social program. Think, for example, of the car. Right? With the car, with automation, etc., automobile motion, came a whole social reorganization, a whole reorganization of everyday life and society. So it's important to see what is the kind of program, and particularly in the history of capitalism, technology has always been used, right, to basically strip people of their skills, to destroy forms of organization. So it's not technology or non-technology. It's always important to see what this technology is really, accomplishing. And adding the dead cows, I think that's very powerful because it's real. It's even more than that. When you look at the digital technology, and Shaka went through a whole very extensive list of the minerals that are needed. You see that in order to have those minerals, lithium, for example, you have to destroy a lot of communal lands, a lot of fields. You have to displace millions of people. Much of the displacement that is going on today across the world, which is also triggering the big migratory movements, are really a result of these extractivist policies. Mining companies now are really scouring the world and displacing people, and they have their own often, their own guards, their own army, to get the minerals, the waters, and so on, that are necessary for our computers, that are necessary. And I really think we need to take a much more critical look, also from the point of view of how these gadgets are produced. We cannot keep only looking at, what can be done with them or not, but also how they are produced, I think, is extremely important, because there is an immense amount of destruction of land, and if we are concerned about, climatic change and everything, destruction of land, destruction of communities, displacement, and so on. And about refusal, collective refusal, of course, so many struggles, right, are example of refusal. But I think, for me, it was very important, the experience being in the women's movement and looking at the world, with the eyes of, different kind of working class experiences, the experience of the factory, the strike, and looking at from the point of view of what they call reproduction, then you begin to see there is all kinds of collective refusal. They are not visible, but they are there. You know, like for instance, the birth rate collapse. You know, after World War II, you know, in countries like Germany or like Italy, the birth rate went to zero. In fact, that's a collective refusal. It's a lot of women say, no way, you know, I'm not going to have the 5, 6, 7, 10 children. You're under fascism. They gave you a medal after you had 10 children, right? And I'm not going because that work consumes my life. I want to do other things. I don't want to depend on a man, etc., etc. So those forms of silent refusal, invisible refusal, but they are collective because they imply all the question of the family, right? The question of family relation, you know, not refusing the nuclear family. So I think we have to relearn, you know, to see what is a struggle, what is a refusal.
I mean, I've been really interested in these kinds of politics of refusal for a while. I think about them in the context of anarchist collectives like Tikkun. I think about them in terms of the histories of sort of marronage, right? The black communities that, groups of black people who formed other communities with indigenous people who escaped slavery and who developed their own societies, right? Independent. And I think part of that is about, and even in our moment today, we have to understand that we don't have to invent entirely new alternatives, that many of these alternatives have already existed. You know, one thing I was thinking about with the other question, so there's a really famous technologist named Jaron Lanier. He's been around doing work forever. He was one of the people who really helped develop VR, which of course was necessary for AR. He wrote a book recently, it was like top 10 reasons to delete your social media account. So I would be really interested in these kinds of practices of refusal. You know, what happens to these companies, what happens to our forms of sociability when we actually refuse the terms that are given to us. Again, Fred Moten in the Undercommons and elsewhere is a wonderful poet, philosopher, critic. You can find his work sort of everywhere right now. He talks about black fugitivity, which again is this sort of idea tied to marronage, right? This idea that you can sort of refuse the terms that are given to you. I think also queerness in certain ways, you know, kind of queer politics also does that, right? Refusing the kind of forms of normativity that are demanded us of heterosexual reproduction. Again, the feminist movement was really important in this. Imagining alternative forms of sociability, and so on. Yeah.
Part of me wants to say, fuck the family. And also, I would also say that I've considered selling my uterus for Bitcoin for some time, and it's not practical because your bone density is very small. Anyway, my last thought on that was on refusal is that I think once the need for freedom is greater than the fear of death, a revolution can be born. So I think that ultimately would be my answer.
For that, you need a collective conception of life, because the courage to have to say, I'd rather die than do this and that, really comes, you know, when you are within a collective history. I just want to mention something. I was recently in Latin America, and I spoke with a woman from Guatemala, and she was talking about the fact that you know, there are some areas in the highlands of Guatemala where people, the whole village was decimated, and horrible, horrible things have happened. People have been burnt alive. And yet, she said, people keep struggling today to recuperate the lands that were taken away. So I said, what gives them that courage? And she said, well, I don't know, but I think it has to do with our relation to the dead, you know, our relation to the community and to the dead, because we have a very strong ties of solidarity within each other. You know, these are indigenous communities. And also we have a lot of solidarity with the ancestors. When they die, they are always present with us. And this gives you big courage, because you feel part of something that allows you to go beyond the fear, okay, if my life ends, everything is lost, everything, and you see yourself part of something bigger than you know, and that gives you the courage.
That's a great note to end on.
Yeah, I think for both practical and spiritual reasons, that's where we're going to end. I was going to say something about the International Women's Strike, which I think is worth looking up if you want to keep thinking about people working on this particular question of how you identify all this unpaid work and then stop doing it. We'll hang out here for a minute and we can chat, but because we're closing, I'm going to turn it over. Thank you so much to our hosts. Thank you so much to our panelists. You guys were incredible.
Thank you. Thank you. And yes, we can definitely mingle in here because the galleries are going to start to close around us. But I just wanted to say a huge thank you to these panelists for an incredible discussion today and for sticking it out with us. I wanted to also just tell you that the Queens International, we have a closing event on February 24th. That's the last day of the show. An incredible series of programs. My colleague Adrian back there has a bunch of flyers. It includes the book launch for the Carnegie International, as well as a performance by Phil Santos, and a gallery talk with Camel Collective. So it's going to be a fun day if you want to come back. Thank you.